"You see this?" the man boomed, his voice too loud for the quiet VFW hall. He held up a polished display case, a silver star gleaming inside. "My granddad. Single-handedly took out a machine gun nest. They don't make men like that anymore." He looked around, his gaze landing on the old man sitting alone at the end of the bar. "Some people just warm a stool their whole lives, right?" The old man, Arthur, didn't look up. He just slowly rotated the glass of water in his hand. The loud man laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "No stories to tell, old-timer?" Arthur said nothing. He simply reached into his pocket. What happened next would silence that room forever. But what would you do? Type honor in the comments if you believe respect is earned, not demanded. Arthur Jenkins was a creature of habit and silence. At 82, his world had contracted to the size of his small apartment, the corner grocery store, and this stool at the far end of the bar at VFW Post 724. His movements were deliberate, measured, as if conserving a finite supply of energy. He had a slight, almost imperceptible limp in his right leg, a relic of a fall from a ladder 2 years prior, or so he told anyone who asked. The truth was older, buried under 50 years of scar tissue and a story he had never told. His hands, gnarled with arthritis, possessed a tremor that only stilled when he wrapped them around a cold glass. Today it was water. Most days it was water. His face was a roadmap of deep lines, but his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were clear and alert. They missed nothing. They saw the dust motes dancing in the single beam of afternoon sun slanting through the grimy window, the subtle wear on the bartender's smile, the nervous tick in the loud man's jaw. He wore the same thing most days, worn jeans, scuffed work boots, and a faded red flannel shirt, soft as a whisper from years of washing. Tucked deep in the worn denim of his front pocket, a small, heavy weight rested against his thigh. It was a coin, thick and crudely struck, its edges smooth from a lifetime of being turned over and over by his thumb. But what none of them knew, not the bartender polishing glasses, not the other veterans nursing their beers, was that the coin in his pocket was rarer than the metal in the loud man's box, and it told a story that had never been written down. The VFW hall was a sanctuary of ghosts and memory. The air, thick with the scent of stale beer, old wood, and pine sol, was a perfume of familiarity to the men who gathered there. It was a place where you didn't have to explain the 1,000-yard stare or the sudden flinch at a slammed door. On the walls, framed photographs of men in uniform, some smiling, some grim, chronicled the post's history from World War II to Afghanistan. A grand fringed American flag stood in one corner, its colors muted by decades of dust and dim light. Behind the bar, Chloe, a college student working to pay for her nursing degree, moved with an efficiency that bordered on indifference. She knew the regulars, their drinks, their stories, and their silences. Arthur was her favorite kind of regular. Quiet. He'd order one water, maybe a Coke, nurse it for 2 hours, and leave a $5 bill on the bar. He never caused trouble. He never asked for anything. He was just there, part of the furniture. Today, however, the quiet sanctity of the post had been shattered by a newcomer, Kyle. He wasn't a member, but had come in with his uncle, a quiet man who now looked deeply uncomfortable in a corner booth. Kyle was all slicked back hair, expensive tactical pants he'd clearly never worn in the field, and a voice that filled every empty space in the room. 300 miles away, a man in a perfectly pressed dress uniform was finishing a briefing at the Pentagon. He had no idea that in a few hours he would be getting a phone call that would make him drop everything and drive through the night. The conflict began, as it often does, with a mixture of alcohol and insecurity. Kyle, 3 beers in, was holding court. He had brought his grandfather's silver star to share, but it was less about sharing and more about appropriation. He told the story of the machine gun nest, but he told it in the first person. So you're crawling through the mud, right? And the rounds are just zinging past your head. Thwip, 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 he said, making sound effects with his mouth. A few of the older vets exchanged weary glances. They had heard this kind of talk before, stolen valor or something close to it. The stories always grew with each telling and each beer. Arthur, at his end of the bar, simply stared into his glass. He swirled the ice, the cubes clinking softly. The sound was a quiet counterpoint to Kyle's booming narrative. And you just got to ignore the fear, Kyle continued, puffing out his chest. You just got to be a man, you know? He slapped his hand on the bar for emphasis, rattling the glasses. Chloe flinched. Hey, watch it, she said, her voice sharp. Kyle just grinned at her. Sorry, sweetheart. Just getting passionate. It's in the blood. He turned his attention back to his small, captive audience. He then looked down the bar at Arthur. What about you, Pops? You got any war stories? Or were you a cook? The question hung in the air, dripping with condescension. Arthur didn't react. He lifted his glass, took a slow sip of water, and set it back down on the damp napkin. The only sign of his response was the slight tightening of the skin around his pale blue eyes. The disrespect deepened. When Arthur offered no reply, Kyle took it as a victory. He laughed, a short barking sound. See? Nothing. Probably spent the whole time peeling potatoes in Saigon. His uncle, a stooped man named Frank, tried to intervene. Kyle, that's enough. Leave the man alone. But Kyle waved him off. Relax, Uncle Frank. I'm just trying to get some history out of him. These guys are living history, right? Gotta honor them. The word honor sounded obscene coming from his mouth. He was a predator playing with his food. He slid off his stool and walked down the bar, stopping a few feet from Arthur. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial, mocking whisper. Come on, Grandpa. What did you do? Drive a truck? Push a pencil? There's no shame in it. Not everyone can be a hero. The other men in the bar were shifting uncomfortably. This was crossing a line. You didn't do this here. This was a safe place, but no one said anything. They were older men, tired of conflict, and Kyle was a storm of youthful arrogance they had no energy to confront. Arthur remained still, his gaze fixed on the condensation trailing down his glass. He could feel the man's beery breath on his cheek. He could see the sneer on his lips reflected in the polished mahogany of the bar. The younger man thought this was a conversation he was winning. He was profoundly wrong. This was the beginning of the worst, most humiliating day of his life. Inside Arthur's mind, the noise of the bar faded away. The scent of stale Sibir was replaced by the smell of jet fuel and damp jungle rot. The clinking of glasses became the metallic click of a rifle bolt sliding home. He wasn't in a VFW hall in Ohio anymore. He was crouched in the elephant grass of a landing zone somewhere west of Quezon, the air electric with the thump, thump, thump of incoming Huey rotors. He felt the familiar weight of the CAOR-15 in his hands, the reassuring heft of the Ka-Bar knife strapped to his webbing. He remembered the faces of the men he was with. Young men, boys really. their faces painted in camouflage green and black, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and adrenaline, men whose names were now carved on a black granite wall in Washington. Men he had outlived by more than half a century. The tremor in his left hand, the one the doctors called an essential tremor, worsened for a moment. It wasn't from age. It was a ghost, a memory that lived in his nerve endings. It was the same tremor he'd had on the night they pulled Marcus Thorne's recon team out of a hot LZ under a sky lit by tracers. He took a slow, deep breath, pulling himself back from the edge of the past. He was here. He was now. He was an old man in a bar, being taunted by a child. He looked up from his glass for the first time, his pale blue eyes meeting Kyle's in the mirror behind the bar. There was no anger in them. There was no fear. There was just a profound and ancient weariness. The trigger was a single, careless phrase. Goaded by Arthur's silence, Kyle's arrogance swelled to its peak. He gestured expansively at the room. My granddad, he did real black ops stuff, secret missions, stuff you can't even read about. He leaned closer to Arthur, his voice dripping with faux pity. But I get it. Not everyone was cut out for that. Some guys, they just had to stay behind, hold down the fort. That's important too, I guess. He patted Arthur's shoulder. It was a gesture of profound ownership, of dominance. You did your part, I'm sure. Arthur slowly pulled his shoulder away from the unwanted touch. His eyes, which had been distant, were now sharply focused. The weariness was gone, replaced by something cold and hard as chipped flint. Kyle didn't notice the change. He was too caught up in his own performance. He turned back to the rest of the bar, raising his voice again. So let's hear it for the quiet ones, the cooks and the clerks. They also served. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. That was it. That was the line. Arthur reached into his pocket. His hand, the one that trembled, came out steady. It held a small, dark object. He didn't slam it down. He didn't throw it. He placed it gently on the bar and with a single finger slid it across the polished wood. It spun twice, then settled flat with a soft, metallic click. The worst part wasn't the disrespect. The worst part was that he had heard those words before. They also served, spoken with the same dismissive pity, 50 years ago, from a clean-shaven second lieutenant who was dead 6 hours later. Across the room, sitting in a dark booth he favored for its anonymity, General Marcus Thorne, retired, lowered his newspaper. He came to this VFW post once a month, driving 2 hours out of his way because no one here knew who he was. Here he wasn't the former head of Special Operations Command. He was just Marcus, a vet having a quiet beer. He had been trying to ignore the loudmouth at the bar, but the man's voice was like a dentist's drill. He'd seen his type 1,000 times, insecure men who wrapped themselves in the borrowed glory of others. He was about to get up and quietly suggest the man lower his voice when he saw the movement at the end of the bar. He saw the old man in the flannel shirt. He saw him slide something across the wood. Even from 30 feet away, Thorne recognized the shape, the size, the dull, non-reflective finish. His blood went cold. It couldn't be. He squinted, his focus sharpening. The object came to a rest under the dim bar lights. It was a coin, dark, heavy, and utterly without adornment save for a strange, esoteric symbol etched into its center. A skull wearing a green beret, superimposed over a stylized parachute, and a lightning bolt. Thorne's breath caught in his throat. He knew that symbol. It was a ghost from his own past. There were only a handful of those coins still in existence, and the men who carried them. The men who carried them were not cooks or clerks. They were legends, or they were dead. Kyle stared at the coin. It was ugly, crude, nothing like the polished metals in his grandfather's case. It was made of some dark, heavy metal and looked almost handmade. "What's this piece of junk?" he sneered, reaching for it. Before his fingers could touch it, Arthur's hand shot out and covered the coin. It was the trembling hand, but now it was as steady as a granite rock. "Don't," Arthur said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the bar like a razor. It was the first word he had spoken in an hour, and it thus carried the weight of a command. The entire bar fell silent. Everyone was watching now. Chloe, the bartender, stopped wiping a glass. The old vets in the corner booth turned in their seats. Kyle, taken aback by the sudden shift in tone, hesitated. He saw the look in Arthur's eyes, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He tried to recover with bluster. "What? It's just some cheap trinket. You win it at a carnival?" He was doubling down, unable to comprehend that the power dynamic in the room had just fundamentally, irrevocably shifted. He thought he was still in control of the situation. He did not realize that a 4-star general was now walking toward him, his face a mask of disbelief and awe. General Thorne moved with a purpose that made people instinctively get out of his way. The other veterans, sensing the gravity in his stride, parted for him. He walked straight to the bar and stood behind Kyle, his eyes locked on the coin under Arthur's hand. He didn't look at Kyle. He didn't acknowledge anyone else. He spoke, and his voice was a low rumble of authority that commanded instant obedience. "Where did you get that?" he asked Arthur. His tone was not accusatory. It was filled with a desperate, fragile hope. Arthur slowly lifted his hand, revealing the coin. The crude skull, the beret, the lightning bolt. It lay there on the bar, a small, dark island of history. Thorne leaned closer, his eyes tracing the symbol. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a pair of reading glasses, perching them on his nose for a better look. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a very long time. "My God," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I haven't seen one of these in 40 years. He looked up from the coin and met Arthur's pale blue eyes. A flash of recognition, of stunned comprehension lit his face. "Spectre?" he breathed, the name a ghost on his lips. "Is that you? Arthur Jenkins? You're Spectre?" Kyle, confused and feeling his audience slip away, tried to reassert himself. "Hey, who's this guy? And what's a spectre?" Thorne turned his head slowly, and for the first time he fixed Kyle with a gaze so cold and powerful it felt like a physical blow. "This guy," Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave, "is a 4-star general, and you are about to learn a very important lesson in respect." The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the beer cooler. General Thorne never took his eyes off Kyle, but his words were for the entire room. "This," he said, pointing a finger at the coin on the bar, "is not a trinket. This is a MACV-SOG challenge coin. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group." He let the name hang in the air. Most in the room didn't know what it meant, but the way he said it gave it a terrifying weight. It was the most highly classified multi-service special operations unit in the Vietnam War. They conducted covert, unconventional warfare operations, cross-border missions into Laos, Cambodia, North Vietnam. Missions that officially never happened. missions that our government would deny to this day. He paused, looking around the room, ensuring every single person understood. The men in SOG were ghosts. They had the highest casualty rate of any unit in the war, more than 100%. That means every man in the unit was either wounded, some multiple times, or killed. He turned his gaze back to the coin, then to Arthur. His voice softened, now filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. And among those ghosts, there were legends, men who did things that defied belief, men whose very existence was a classified secret. The man you've been calling Pops, the man you accused of peeling potatoes, he was one of them. He was the most legendary of them all. The truth was out now, a brilliant, blinding light in the dim bar. But Kyle, cornered and terrified, was about to make one last, fatal mistake. Kyle's face had gone chalk white. He was trapped, his lies exposed, his stolen valor stripped away in front of everyone. Panic made him stupid. He stammered, looking for an escape. I don't believe you. You're lying. He's just some old man." General Thorne straightened to his full height. He may have been in civilian clothes, but in that moment he was every inch the commanding officer. "You will stand up," he commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "You will address me as General, and you will address this man as Sergeant Major Jenkins, and you will do it now." Kyle, flinching as if struck, scrambled to his feet, knocking his stool over with a clatter. "General, he began. "Silence," Thorne snapped. He turned his attention back to Arthur, his expression changing from fury to one of profound, heartfelt respect. "Sergeant Major," he began, his voice now formal and clear, "forgive this display. It is an honor to see you again." Arthur simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Thorne then turned back to the silent, watching crowd. "I was a captain in 5th Special Forces Group in 1971. My long-range reconnaissance patrol, 6 men, was compromised deep in enemy territory. We were surrounded, wounded, out of ammunition, and calling in airstrikes on our own position. It was a death sentence." He paused, his eyes finding Arthur's. "The choppers couldn't get in. The jungle was too thick, the fire too heavy. We were told there would be no extraction. We were told to make our peace." He took a deep breath. And then out of the darkness came Spectre. Not a team, one man. He came in alone, on foot, for 3 kilometers through an entire NVA battalion. He moved through them like a phantom, and he led us out. He carried my wounded radio operator on his back for the last click. He saved all 6 of our lives that night. He looked at Kyle, whose mouth was hanging open. "Your grandfather's Silver Star is a medal for gallantry. It is a high honor. Sergeant Major Jenkins was recommended for the Medal of Honor for that action, but he couldn't receive it because officially he was never there. This country asked him to be a ghost, to risk everything in the shadows and expect nothing in return. And you mocked him." The vindication was absolute and crushing. Kyle stood there, swaying slightly, his face a mess of shame and disbelief. He looked at Arthur, at the quiet old man in the flannel shirt, and for the first time he truly saw him. He saw the truth of the general's words reflected in those pale, steady eyes. He saw a history he couldn't comprehend, a courage he could never possess. The bar was a tableau of stunned faces. The other veterans, men who had served in conventional units, stared at Arthur with a new and profound awe. They had been sitting beside a living legend for years and had never known it. They were in the presence of a man who belonged to the highest, most secret echelon of their shared brotherhood. Chloe, the bartender, leaned against the back counter, her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were wide, glistening with unshed tears. She looked from Arthur to the ugly, crude coin on the bar, now understanding its immense value. It wasn't just metal. It was a testament. It was proof of a life lived at the very edge of human endurance. Frank, Kyle's uncle, walked over from his booth. He didn't look at his nephew. He walked straight to Arthur, his own eyes wet with emotion. He was a Vietnam vet himself, a Marine. He stopped in front of Arthur, drew himself to a rigid posture of attention, and executed a slow, perfect salute. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant Major," he said, his voice thick. Arthur looked at him, and a flicker of something, gratitude, shared understanding, passed between them. He gave a slight nod. "At ease, Marine," he said softly. The words were a quiet benediction. In the immediate aftermath, a heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the soft clatter of Kyle's uncle righting the fallen bar stool. Kyle himself seemed to shrink, the bluster and arrogance evaporating until all that was left was a pale, frightened young man. He opened his mouth, then closed it, no apology adequate for the sacrilege he had committed. Without another word, he turned and practically fled the VFW hall, leaving the display case with his grandfather's medal sitting forgotten on the bar. His uncle watched him go with a look of deep sorrow and disappointment before turning back to Arthur. "Sergeant Major, on behalf of my family, I am so sorry." Arthur just shook his head slightly. "It's forgotten," he said, and the simple absolution seemed to lift a weight from the older man's shoulders. General Thorne placed a hand on Arthur's arm. "Art," he said, the formality gone, "is it really you? We all thought you were gone. You just disappeared after the war." Arthur finally offered a small, weary smile. "That was the point, Marcus. We were supposed to disappear." What the general didn't realize was that someone was already watching this unfold from afar. The bartender, Chloe, had quietly taken out her phone and started recording when the general began his story, and the video was already uploading to a network of veterans groups about to give a ghost the recognition he had been denied for 50 years. The next few days were a quiet revolution for Arthur Jenkins. The video Chloe posted went viral within the veteran community. His phone, which usually only rang with calls from telemarketers, began ringing constantly. It was men he hadn't spoken to in 50 years. Men from the old unit, the few who were left, their voices choked with emotion as they heard his. "Spectre, you old bastard, you're alive," one of them shouted through a crackling connection from a ranch in Montana. News outlets picked up the story. A local reporter showed up at his apartment, followed by a national news crew. They wanted to hear his story, the story of the ghost of MACV-SOG. But Arthur, true to his nature, politely declined. He hadn't done it for the recognition then, and he didn't need it now. The real change happened at VFW Post 724. The post commander officially barred Kyle for life. His grandfather's medal was quietly returned to his uncle, but more importantly, the entire atmosphere of the place shifted. When Arthur walked in now, the conversations would quiet for a moment. Men would nod to him with a new level of deference. They didn't crowd him or ask for stories. They understood that his silence was as much a part of his service as his actions. They simply gave him his space, but it was a space now filled with a palpable, unspoken respect. Chloe always had his glass of water waiting for him, and she refused to let him pay. "Your money's no good here, Sergeant Major," she'd say, with a warm smile. She wasn't just a bartender anymore. She was a guardian of his peace. The change in her was profound. She saw every elderly veteran now not as a piece of furniture, but as a library of unread stories. She had learned a lesson that would shape her career as a nurse and her life as a person. The quietest people often have the most to say. True honor is not loud. It does not need to announce itself. It is quiet, patient, and forged in crucibles we can barely imagine. It resides in the hearts of men like Arthur Jenkins, who are asked to do the impossible for their country and then to fade away, to carry the weight of their deeds in silence. They don't seek parades or accolades. Their reward is the quiet knowledge of a job well done, of brothers saved, of a promise kept. The world is full of people like Kyle, who mistake volume for value and arrogance for strength. But they are just noise. The real strength, the real legacy, is in the quiet dignity of a life of service. It's in the steady hand that once held a rifle and now holds a simple glass of water. It's in the pale blue eyes that have seen the worst of humanity, but still choose to see the good. The next time you see an old man sitting alone, remember Arthur. You are not looking at a relic of the past. You are in the presence of a pillar that holds up the world you live in. His story, and the stories of countless others like him, are the bedrock of our freedom. They are the ghosts who guard our sleep. If their stories of sacrifice and silent honor inspire you, subscribe to our channel for more tales that remind us of the heroes who walk among us every day.